Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second Countdown to COP26 event. My name is Jeff Erickson. I'm the General Manager of Client Engagement at the Global CCS Institute, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. Countdown to COP is a monthly webinar series being held from July to November, where we explore carbon capture and storage COP26 and the path to net zero. We have another great program for you today. We'll be discussing the regional climate commitments and the role of CCS within those. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Global CCS Institute, we're an international think tank whose mission is to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage, a vital technology to tackle climate change and deliver climate neutrality. Throughout today's webinar, next slide, please. You can submit your questions using the Q&A function on the Zoom control panel you see at the bottom of your screen. We are recording this session, and in the coming days, the recording will be made available on the Institute's website. Next slide, please. COP26 is scheduled to take place in Glasgow this November, and in 2020, the annual COP gathering was postponed due to the pandemic. But over the last year, we've seen many new climate commitments being made by both governments and businesses. The urgency of action has never been clearer than it is right now. This summer, Europe experienced devastating floods, and the United States has seen constant heat waves and catastrophic forest fires. And of course, our Gulf Coast is right now enduring the most powerful hurricane to ever hit the state of Louisiana. Further evidence that a warming atmosphere will result in more severe weather events impacting the lives of people, not just in the distant future, but right now. Progressive climate policies are the primary driver of carbon capture climate action. The United States, the region which currently has the highest number of both existing CCS facilities and those in development, is one such example, with the 45Q tax credit acting as a significant driver of CCS investment. In Europe, the European Commission is looking to scale up low carbon technologies across the continent to tackle industrial emissions with the Fit for 55 package, aiming to enhance the delivery of Europe's 2050 climate targets. Having now included additional policy proposals that will drive the deployment of CCS, the new climate package illustrates the need for CCS to achieve Europe's climate goals. In the Asia Pacific region, China, the world's largest consumer of energy, has announced plans to peak their carbon emissions by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality before 2060. And there is growing recognition of the necessity of CCS to achieve those goals. And in Norway, the government is providing funding for the Langskip project, enabling Northern Lights to provide secure CO2 storage for much of Northern Europe. Over the last year, we've seen CCS policy commitments be proposed and take effect, driving a steady growth in the CCS market. The Global CCS Institute is looking forward to seeing this year's COP meeting move the needle further forward, both in terms of carbon capture deployment and climate action more broadly. And with that as context, let me introduce today's session. Today, we'll be speaking to three climate policy experts who can shed light on the climate ambitions that we are seeing take off ahead of COP26. And I'll ask the panelists to turn on their videos now, please. Stig Svenningsen is with the government of Norway and is the Deputy Director General at the Norwegian Ministry of Petroleum and Energy. Joining us from the United States is Shuchi Talati. Shuchi is the Chief of Staff of the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, part of the US Department of Energy. And we're also joined by Paul Watkinson. He's the former chair of the UNFCCC subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. And Paul has extensive experience in international climate policy and was part of the team that prepared and ran COP21 in 2015, from which the Paris Agreement emerged. And he's joining us from France. Thank all of you for being here today. Stig, I'm going to start with you. And this will be a question that applies to all three of the panelists. But if you could start us out today, what outcomes does the Norwegian government want to see at COP26, both generally and for CCS specifically?
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. From the Norwegian side, we want an outcome from Glasgow where clear political signals are given on increased ambitions, especially related to the updated NDCs, but also on climate finance and adaptation. On the more technical issues, we want outcomes on Article 6 and on transparency. We don't necessarily have a desired outcome for CCS as such, but our outcomes are linked more to making sure that Article 6 is compatible with CCS, so to speak. And we have also added in suggestions for the transparency part on CCS. For instance, we have submitted views on how to calculate negative emissions from bio-CCS and so on. In my personal view, it's not necessarily important that CCS is discussed in the negotiations, but as I said, it's more a question of making sure that the negotiations facilitate and incentivize CCS. And that means that increased ambitions would be a good thing for CCS. I think I will stop there. If you have more questions, please follow up.
Well, Stig, just one follow-up. I know there's a lot of people that are on this webinar that understand what Article 6 is, but there's probably many that don't. So can you just describe what Article 6 is, kind of in layman's terms, so that folks can get some context for that?
Yes, I will try. Article 6 is the article on how to collaborate to achieve mitigation outcomes. So that means it could be market-based collaboration or it could be non-market-based collaboration. So in general, it's all about how we can work together.
And that's generally collaboration across national boundaries, correct?
Yes, country to country.
Right, thank you. Shuchi, over to you, and would love to hear from you what DOE and the US government wants to see at COP, both generally and for CCS.
Sure. Well, I'll say generally, I think the most important thing we want to see is, leveraging this new administration and the, major dedication to climate that has come over the last 8 months. We've seen major goals, that were initially announced in January around net zero by 2050, but also we saw so many more commitments that were made during Climate Week in April from the President and from the Secretary of Energy. We're incredibly excited to work to achieve 100% clean electricity by 2035 and halving our emissions by 2030. These are incredibly ambitious, and DOE is going to play an incredibly important role in meeting those goals, but global participation is absolutely vital to meeting those targets for every country that has them. And so really engaging those conversations from this new administration and ensuring that we are able to ensure our partners and our allies that the United States is here to work on climate change, and we are excited to do so and to do everything we can and to use every tool in our toolkit. And one of those being CCS. And so, for CCS, I don't think we have an official goal, but I think we want to look towards a lot more cooperation to build a strategy around deployment of this technology. When it comes to both the power and industrial sector, there are major needs for CCS, across the globe. And so the United States can play a really critical role in leveraging the R&D that we've already done for the last 2 decades. And we want to share that knowledge with our partners. I would say one other goal that we want to help around CCS is to create a better narrative. I think there hasn't been a positive narrative around CCS that has been, really propagated by the United States, and that we want to help kind of create language around that CCS is vital for climate. We want to ensure, advocacy organizations and environmental NGOs that we are not trying to use this technology to enable the fossil fuel industry, but to limit climate change, to limit harm to climate vulnerable populations. And that is our goal as the United States government. I'll also say finally that we want a further discussion around CDR. While the CCS and CDR are distinct portfolios, there are of course overlaps when it comes to carbon storage, carbon transportation, when it comes to direct air capture, and as Stig referred to, bioenergy with CCS. And so making sure that we are enabling that side of the conversation, and where CCS has a role to play when it comes to negative emissions, is also going to be critical.
So first acronym check of the day, CDR.
Apologies, carbon dioxide removal. And so that refers to approaches that remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere rather than point source carbon capture to limit the emissions from the fossil fuel and industrial sectors.
Great. And one other clarification from you. You mentioned a goal of 100% clean energy by 2035. How does DOE define clean energy, and what role is carbon capture in that definition?
Sure. So it's clean electricity, and we are defining that goal as zero emissions. Or net zero emissions from the electricity sector. And so CCS has such an important role to play because as we all know, in the United States, there are huge infrastructure commitments that we have around the natural gas sector that I think it's around over 200 gigawatts that will be retiring before 2035. CCS is the only way to decarbonize the natural gas sector. The industrial sector obviously is going to be so critical for CCS to help limit those emissions. That's not part of the clean electricity goal, but is part of the 50% emissions reductions by 2030 goal. We have 90 cement plants in the United States, all of which run on coal. The only way to address those emissions from the process emissions of cement are CCS. And so it's ensuring that we also build education and knowledge capacity around understanding the need for CCS, both across the country, across the world, and really ensuring that governance officials also have that knowledge.
Great. Thanks for that. Now over to Paul. And Paul, first of all, worth clarifying that you're not representing the French government, that you are speaking as an individual here. And so there's no particular policy positions that you're speaking for the government for. But that probably gives you a bit more freedom than the others to talk about what it is that you personally want to see as someone who's been involved in COP and the negotiations for quite a long time. What do you want to see from COP26 generally and as it relates to CCS?
Great. Well, thank you. And it's good to listen first to what Stig and Shuchi have both said. And I think there's a lot in what they've been saying that I can share and want to build on. As you said, I'm not officially speaking in this on behalf of the French government, although I do work for the French Ministry for Ecological Transition, and I've been their chief negotiator. I was their chief negotiator for many, many years. So I'm more in a personal capacity in this thinking here. But if I'm looking forward to the COP this year and then looking beyond COP26 as well, the first challenge is most clearly the issue of ambition. It's about ramping up the level of climate action. We've just had a few weeks ago the latest report from the IPCC with the Working Group 1 as the first part of the 6th assessment review. It probably hasn't fundamentally changed our understanding, but it's made it a lot clearer and a lot more high definition, the reality, the urgency, and the fact that we can act. And we're simply not on a pathway at the moment to stay to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. And we're also in a time when governments are investing massively to rebuild and to recover from the COVID-19 disaster we've had globally over the past 18 months. And we're not using that recovery well enough to put us on that pathway. So I think that's a context we have to start with. And I think how much we've had some good announcements over the past year. Yes, we see a number of governments setting targets for 2050, 2060, giving us a sense of where they're going to raise their nationally determined contributions for the next 10 years. But those still are not aligned. And we still need more across the board to put us on the right pathway. So that's the first political goal, I think. How much further can COP26 take us to align that, particularly with many countries that have not yet made the announcements they could do. Second is, delivery, or linked with that is delivery. Stig mentioned finance, delivery there, delivery on adaptation. All of these matter as well. The second big part is finalizing some of the rules of the Paris Agreement. And I, as a former chair of the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice, I was responsible for that for a couple of years. I failed to deliver a outcome on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And as was said, that's how you account in many ways for the cooperation the parties have and how they exchange mitigation outcomes. The credibility of that matters, because if you get it wrong, accounting is boring in many ways, but if you get it wrong, you undermine the environmental integrity and the ambition of the whole system. It can be a powerful tool. Cooperation can be a powerful tool for building more action, getting more players on board. But if you get it badly wrong, and that's where the challenge is, to get that right, so that the complex exchanges between parties reflect accurately what is happening and don't create double counting or distort the effects of what is happening. Two very quick points, and I'll stop for now. The first point is, it's not just about what governments do, it's about what many other actors do. And in the last few years during the COPs, we've had an increasingly large space for non-state actors to be involved. The sort of partnerships linking sometimes governments, but companies, cities and local government as well, around civil society more generally, cooperating, collaborating on specific challenges. Now that's an area where clearly people can work in the energy sector, industry and specific challenges, including in some cases the role of CCS. And that's, it's not the things that we're going to try and negotiate to agree together how we do them, but by working together with those who've got most to offer and bring to the table, you can deliver a lot more. The final point, and this again comes from the IPCC, what we've seen, but also the increasing focus on getting to net zero by the middle of the century. We are going to have to start a conversation on what that means, because at the moment we're not all meaning the same thing when we use those terms. And there are definitions. The IPCC has been clarifying the difference between net zero in terms of carbon dioxide or all greenhouse gases and what that means for stabilizing concentrations and temperatures. We're going to start that conversation, probably not in Glasgow, but I think it's going to come up when we come to the global stocktake in 2023. And I think if we look beyond Glasgow to 2023, there are quite a lot of things which are going to come together there. How we exchange between us, what some parties do and expect others to deliver, again, coming back to the Article 6 cooperation type thing, the voluntary cooperation, we're going to have to look at what those mean in more detail. There are equity issues there, there are environmental integrity issues there, and it's clear that in some of those, the role of CCS will be a thing we'll have to look at in more detail.
Wow, a lot there, and I want to unpack some of that in the questions to come. So there's a great tee up for some of the things that we'll explore a bit further. Let me come back to Stig, and we heard from Shuchi some of the specific commitments that DOE or the U.S. government is making. Stig, you stated a bit at a higher level for the government of Norway. Is there anything else as far as specific actions that the government will take to support the climate ambition, both with respect to carbon capture and other technologies?
Yes, and yes, I would say. First, I can start with our targets. So our targets that we have submitted into the Paris Agreement in our NDC is that by 2030, we will reduce our emissions by 50 to 55% below 1990 levels. In addition, we have a target for 2050 enshrined in our climate law that is 90 to 95% below 1990. And that is not including LULUCF. So in practice, that means that we will go net negative with this target in 2050. Our uptake in the forest is 50% of our national emissions today. So it's quite a lot of uptake in forests and so on, but that's not included in either of these targets. We have stated that we would like to cooperate with the European Union in fulfilling our climate targets, because the European Union is our closest ally, both in the climate change negotiations, but also where our markets are. So most of our trade and cooperation in general is with the European Union, so it makes sense to continue working also on the climate targets. So when it comes to CCS, we have included CCS in our ICTU. That is the description of how our NDC is, how to interpret our NDC. And to be honest with you, it was we had a discussion if it's necessary to include CCS in the ICTU, because we have been talking a lot about CCS, as you mentioned earlier, in other situations, and we thought that it might actually be already clarified, so we do not have to add. But then we made the decision that it's not only the fact that we must do CCS, but it's also the symbol of including CCS in our ICTU. So we did that. You mentioned the Longship project, where we will capture CO2 from a cement plant and transport it by ship and store it below the seabed in the North Sea. The wish of the Norwegian government is to develop a market for CO2 storage, not just the capture, but the storage part. That's where we have our, most of our resource would be storage, the storage capacity that we have, because we have a very long coastline. We also want to decarbonize our industry with CCS. We want to develop hydrogen and bio-CCS. So the aim is that the Longship will be a catalyst for the development of CCS in Europe and internationally. Thank you.
Well, it sounds like you've got plenty to keep you busy over the next 30 years. Thanks for that, Stig. And Shuchi, is there any additional granularity that you want to provide to the commitments that the US will come into the COP meeting with?
Not necessarily in the COP meeting, but I do want to emphasize kind of the really changing conversation around CCS in the US government happening right now. In the infrastructure package that's currently in Congress, there is a massive commitment to funding CCS deployments, pilots, R&D, and this is across sectors. And the last time we had these kinds of funds was over a decade ago. And so, really being able to realize our targets around demonstration will be so valuable to the commitments that we can make around these technologies in the future. Because without demonstration, especially for CCS on natural gas, we don't really fully understand costs. And that's where a role DOE, that's the role DOE really needs to play here, is to better understand how this technology functions and what we can signal to industry around what we've learned. The other piece I want to add too is our commitment to storage. There's over $2.5 billion committed for carbon storage in the infrastructure package. We are committed to ensuring reliable storage, and I want to emphasize what Paul said around carbon accounting. We are committed to ensuring that accounting is robust, and that means understanding what quality storage means, ensuring good MRV, and ensuring that we have long-term commitments to better understanding the life cycle analysis around CO2. And we've done so much robust research in this space across the world, but we're not there yet, and we need more. And DOE is ready to fund that work.
Great. And second acronym, check MRV, is monitoring, reporting, and verification programs. There we go. And Stig, by the way, speaking of acronyms, you used an acronym that I'm not familiar with, ICTU, as a way to account for the national determined contributions. What is ICTU? Is that an international application, or is that Norwegian specific? Norway specific?
No, that's a Paris Agreement language, but it means it's just very shortly. It's a description on how the NDC is to be interpreted and fulfilled.
Great, thanks for that. So Paul, you've heard from representatives from both Norway and the US on what they want to bring to Glasgow. My question to you is, how do you expect other nations to react to those commitments? Will they be broadly supportive? Will they see, excuse me, those commitments as being too aggressive or not aggressive enough?
Okay. I mean, just on the last point, we're talking about clarity, transparency, and understanding, which are the terms we put in the Paris Agreement to enable us to give meaning to what parties put on the table. We don't predefine it, but we need that to be demonstrated by parties. In terms of how people are likely to react to what the US, Norway, and others are bringing to the table, I think the Paris Agreement approach isn't one where we sit down and say, each of us looks at what the other and says, you're doing enough, you're not doing enough. We don't get into judgments on what each of us is doing around the table. There'll be plenty written on that. And I'm fairly sure from civil society and many others, we'll have some fairly clear and frank assessments of who could do more, who is doing enough already. Are we really on track? The point is, collectively, we're not on track. And the only way to do that is to work together to raise our individual and our collective ambition. And that's where collaboration is essential, because if we have that collaboration, it gives us the reassurance that we're all working in the same direction, but it also allows us to work on the concrete challenges we encounter on the way. The other part of it is the information side again, the clarity of information, the transparency. If we know what each of us is doing, it again provides a positive feedback to help us go further down the line. So of course, I'd love to see everybody raise their ambition. Norway, the US, the European Union with our 55% target already on the table, and all the work for the Fit for 55 internally to fill that out and to deliver. But it's the delivery now, which I think will be the key focus, and that acceleration as we move forward.
Thank you. And Paul, I want to continue with you for a minute. You mentioned one of the things in your framing comments you mentioned was COVID and the recovery from the global crisis that we experienced a year ago. At the last COP meeting, of course, COVID wasn't even on the radar. Do you see, and I'll ask the same for Stig and Shuchi, do you see recovery from the COVID crisis and the economic crisis that was associated with that? Do you see that as a driver or a hindrance to climate ambitions? You know, there's the climate aspect or the environmental aspect of recovery and economic aspects of it. How do you see the recovery plans affecting the conversation that we'll have in Glasgow?
I mean, you could argue that on a first glance, you were talking about different things. But when you look closely, you realize we are talking about exactly the same things. We're talking about governments mobilizing enormous resources in terms of investment in infrastructure, in tackling many of the challenges in front of us to rebuild our economies after the last 18 months and the shock that we felt. And it is an enormous opportunity which has presented itself. I wish it hadn't happened this way. I wish there were other reasons we were making this investment today, but that is on the table. The question is, how do we use that opportunity? We had something similar in the late 2000s after the financial crisis. And unfortunately, the investment which was delivered then was not focused on tackling the climate crisis. Far too much of it went into the business as usual fossil economy and didn't enable us to make the difference which we needed. It's an opportunity we have today, but unfortunately at the moment, we saw that with the analysis from the International Energy Agency and others, we're not focusing enough of the recovery packages yet, particularly on the transformation of the energy sector, and then the issues of industry and the many other areas we need to tackle. So, I mean, it's an opportunity to really rebuild. We need to use it well. And I think the COP26, the many different meetings which have been taking place at a high level on climate change have been an opportunity to focus the minds of, at the highest level, presidents, prime ministers, ministers, not just of climate, but of industry, of energy, of the different sectors which are concerned, to think about how to use those resources in the wisest way. And we need to keep on focusing on that to deliver.
Yeah, and so Shuchi, do you agree with Paul that we should the government should take more, capture the moment, if you will, coming out of the economic, or as part of the economic recovery?
I do, and I think you heard that a lot in President Biden's, remarks over the last year. We want to build back better, and I think that's a huge reason that this infrastructure package has the momentum it does. I think there is broad agreement that we need to make the investments that we can while we are in this space of, being able to change the way we invest in infrastructure and the way we're supporting the economy. And I think, the COP is a really important place to have a lot of these discussions. We are struggling globally from recovery from this pandemic. And when it comes to climate change, there are compounding impacts when it comes to COVID and climate. They are not separable issues. And we're seeing that right now with Hurricane Ida. It's just incredibly distressing to see the impacts of the hurricane on hospitals that cannot evacuate. And these are not one-off issues. And it is our responsibility to ensure that the global population understands how these two major issues impact one another. And it is, our goal as the US government to ensure that we change the way, we talk about adaptation, the way we talk about public health and climate change. And I think this is a major opportunity to do so.
And Stig, how the European perspective on how the focus on recovery will impact positions at COP?
Thank you. I agree with the previous speakers, and I think the analysis from Paul is very accurate. I also think I would go back to one of the things I said in my opening statement, and that is that climate finance would be you can maybe see this influencing the positions on climate finance this time, that it will be used in the arguments of why climate finance is very important for to help developing countries get funding for a climate resilient recovery, for instance, if you are connecting it directly into positions in the negotiations. I also think that they might also be part of the discussion on innovation, technology development, and transfer. I think these are areas in the negotiations where these it fits very well with what Paul said about the building, and also the US about building back better, because these are some of the tools, so to speak, that you have to ensure exactly that.
Mm-hmm. Stig, I'm going to stick with you for a minute. We're hearing a lot these days about climate finance, but it tends to be at a fairly high level. A kind of conceptual, we need to be able to finance climate carbon capture projects and climate projects more generally. So what does climate finance actually look like as it relates to carbon capture? Is it discounted rates, or governments enabling finance? Is it private sector? Is it the multilaterals? What do you see as finance for carbon capture in particular, and climate more broadly, looking like, coming out of Glasgow?
In general, as you know, that the World Bank has a capacity building fund, at least for CCS, and they are working on several different options to fund projects going forward. I think the World Bank, this will be important for at least some countries. When it comes to CCS and climate finance, I think some of the challenges is that it's very closely related to fossil fuels and the continued use of fossil fuels, which makes it it's very difficult for the argument of climate, let's say the GCF or maybe the JEF to fund CCS projects that, for instance, will be connected with enhanced oil recovery. I think it might be much easier if we are talking about the decarbonizing industry or negative emissions, for instance. So it's sorry?
No, Stig, you froze up there for a minute. So we lost about 10 seconds.
Okay. No, I think it's more about, as long as it's connected to fossil fuels, it might be more difficult than if you connect it with negative emissions or industry, for instance. So, but that's my personal view. I've heard that the GCF have had issues discussing EOR projects, for instance. And that goes back to the discussion of the continued use of fossil fuels. And that's, I'm not saying that it's not a climate measure, but it has some connotations that could be challenging in the discussions.
Right. And describe GCF, the Global Climate Fund. What is that?
Yeah, GCF in the Green Climate Fund.
Green Climate Fund, thank you. Shuchi, Paul, any additional comments with respect to finance and what that will look like? Go ahead, Paul.
Please go ahead. No, I was going to echo what Stig said. I think there are really important considerations on how we are framing CCS and what other pieces of transported use and storage we are talking about when we talk about point source carbon capture. And I think that clarity is going to be incredibly important when we are figuring out global financing measures. I think the United States and the Department of Energy really want to emphasize reliable storage. And so I think globally that's going to be part of an important discussion on making sure that the carbon is actually not getting back into the atmosphere. And when it comes to financing these projects, it's going to be a priority for us to ensure that piece.
Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I very much in line with, I think, what Stig was saying in particular. Obviously, the first place to start on this is not to finance the things, new coal, other areas, and increasingly the collaboration around moving out of coal, ending, traditional internal combustion engines. Those are the sort of things which I think will come around in a sort of parallel agreements around COP26. Probably not the whole global community is ready to say that. On the other hand, as many countries as possible moving in that direction is essential. In terms of where you're trying to finance specific tools, on CCS, I'd share what Stig was saying. I think if you're looking particularly into areas of industry, there are questions about how you do this with bioenergy and CCS in the future as we move into areas around negative emissions. They raise some big questions, and it comes back to what I was saying on thinking about what we really mean by getting to net negative, carbon neutrality, climate neutrality by the middle of the century, when it's not going to work if we've got high emissions and we try to balance them by massive absorptions. We have to bring emissions to zero as far as we can across the board. So those are parts of the equation which will come in. And I think those will increasingly focus some of the debates on what is the role for CCS as part of the meeting those challenges.
Great, thank you. So, Shuchi, I'm going to start with you with another topic that Paul raised in his initial remarks, and that's the role of actors, organizations that are not national governments. So that might include subnational governments, might include supranational governments. It also may include other interests such as NGOs and industry. How do you see their role at COP? Will they be influential, or will the focus and the heavy lift still remain with national governments?
Well, I mean, my hope is always that civil society has a big voice at these meetings. I think, a lot of these organizations have been, clamoring for these conversations for a long time, and they have a lot of important contributions to these discussions. I think especially when it comes to global climate justice and, carbon management, I think there's a really important overlap that we need to help promote. And I think that's an important role of national governments at these meetings. I think obviously when it comes to agreements, national governments have a much bigger role to play inevitably, but that doesn't diminish the role that we need to have in lifting up so many more voices when it comes to these conversations. and I think when it comes to CCS specifically, this has been a difficult place for, ENGOs and civil society organizations, industry and governments to find agreement. And I think the last 20 years have been indicative of these disagreements. I think it's my hope for the COP that we have just more constructive conversations around these technologies and what they mean for our new climate targets and where they have an important role to play. I think, as Stig said, the industrial sector, certain CDR approaches, I think there are clear overlaps, and I think it's really investing in those spaces and finding those spots of agreement and lifting those pieces of the conversation up. And that's what I'm excited for at the COP.
Great. Stig, anything to add to that?
I agree with everything Shuchi said, but I also would like to say that if you, like me, go very thoroughly through the decision text, you would also see the recognition of, in the text coming out of the negotiations, especially after Paris, how important these different groups and constellations are in taking action on the ground. So not only in the negotiations, but to actually do adaptation projects, do emission reduction projects. So we should also encourage their cooperation, their work and the cooperation in the actions that we are taking, not just the negotiations.
Mm-hmm. And Paul, anything that you want to add? You can take a pass on this if you'd like.
No, I mean, it's very much in line. I think we're agreeing with each other far too much. You need a bit more dynamic of disagreement between us on something. But it is, governments set policy frameworks. That is vital. And giving clarity on where we're heading towards climate neutrality by the middle of the century across the board, targets for 2025, 2030, which really drive short-term action. But the mobilization of all these other actors is a key part. It's a feedback to it as well, because if as governments, we also hear from industry that the framing is needed, the policy is needed to help go faster. Yes, there'll always be some who will be maybe dragging their feet. There are vested interests, there are lobbies who do try to slow down the transformation, but there are also many who try to drive it forward by being clear of the type of clear goals and policy tools which will help that happen. And where there are real challenges, it's about how we overcome those challenges. That's about the just transition. It's about training. It's about requalifying workforce. Those are the things we'll also need to address as we move forward. Not everything will be easy. There will be a lot of challenges to overcome in the next few decades, unfortunately, very many. But if you've got the policy framework, the feedback between business, civil society and governments, the COP is merely a forum for that. A lot of that is at a national level, it's on the ground, and that needs to be driving things as we go forward.
Thank you for that. So last question before we go to audience questions, last question for me anyway. Shuchi, you talked about changing the narrative, and first question is it really about the narrative? Isn't it really about incentives? Isn't it just about policies that will enable businesses to invest? What's the role of the narrative? Maybe this is an opportunity to disagree. What's the role of the narrative in deploying more carbon capture? And if there is an important role, how do we change the narrative? So Shuchi, I'll start with you and then go to Paul and then Stig.
Sure. I think the narrative is an incredibly key piece of deployment. I fully agree that incentives and policy structures are absolutely necessary to enable deployment. But without a positive narrative, deployment can't be successful. You need communities to support a lot of these changes, and you need to have, structures in place that enable, just a positive way of viewing a lot of these technologies. I think right now, if we were to cite CCS in certain places where there aren't, supportive communities, I think that would be the story, not the deployment. And I don't even know if the deployment would be successful. I think we need to have a way of talking about CCS that highlights climate, that is extremely strategic, and that focuses on, the issues that communities have been facing. And I think it's enabling a more inclusive conversation. It's enabling just a more coherent way of creating a community of, understanding around what this technology is and why it's needed, where it's needed, and what our goals are for it. And so, I'll just say that, I think a really important example of this is with the environmental justice organizations. I think there's a lot of disagreement for the need of CCS. But I think if we can engage with a lot of these organizations and communities and talk about, how we are viewing this technology and how we're thinking about deploying it, I'm not saying we're going to fix everything, but I'm saying we can at least come from a better place of understanding to have a more supportive discussion. And I think that's what the narrative is. It's about saying that this is not coming from the fossil fuel industry. We are not trying to enable an industry that has caused harm to you. We are trying to limit climate emissions. And let's start from there.
Great. Stig, over to you on the narrative.
I actually agree with everything Shuchi said, so I have nothing to add on this.
Great. Paul?
I think there's a very important point in there, which I think we should all draw from our conversation. You need to associate people to the development of policies. It's one of the challenges with working on climate change, even more so at an international level, but at a national level, we can easily fall into this rather top-down, technocratic way of thinking. And if you don't bring people along with us, it's one of the biggest challenges. We've seen it in many countries. Unfortunately, you push policies forward, but you lose people's trust for some reason, particularly when you ask people to pay or you're asking people to accept technologies they're not sure of. That is a complex thing because in many fields, we're seeing it in with vaccines, for example, to deal with COVID-19, however vital they are, it's still difficult to persuade some people to go along with that. How do we manage that in other areas as we move forward? It's a similar challenge for public policy making and development. And I think that's one we really need to share experience and learn from. It's got to be involving people.
Yeah, great point, Paul. Thank you. I'm going to move now to audience questions, and we've got 10 minutes or so left. Let's try to keep these responses quick so we can get to as many as we can. I'll start with Stig. Stig, one of the questions is that Norway is positioning its Langskip project as a European-wide, or at least Northern European-wide opportunity for storage. And so the question is, does the government of Norway or private parties have in place agreements? What's the mechanism? What's the cost? How will Norway charge for storage? What does that international element of Langskip look like?
There's a lot of different parts of this question, but the policy of the Norwegian government is that this is a commercial project, and if the actors in the Langskip project or Northern Lights, as the storage is called, enters into commercial agreements with other companies to receive their CO2, the Norwegian government would look favorable on this. There are international regulations and rules in place that we need to comply with, and that is, for instance, the London Protocol and all the rules that we have to do, and that means that we would have to have a bilateral agreement with the sender country. But that is something that the Norwegian government has said that we are willing to enter into. We have not entered into any such agreements yet, so I cannot answer the other questions on costs and so on.
Yep. Okay, great. So this will go to all of you. Do you think that a carbon tax agreement, international carbon tax agreement, one that moves beyond national boundaries, will that be developed? Are there conversations around that that are relevant to this COP meeting? Do you see it happening in the near future, or perhaps a distant future, or not at all? Paul, let's start with you.
I've had conversations along this for many, many years, and quite frankly, it's not going to happen. However appealing it might be, however good it looks coming from an economic model to say, oh, let's put an international carbon tax at the right level and all agree on what it will be. It's not the way that international collaboration works, and we don't even have a carbon tax in all countries. Most countries are following different policy approaches. So, I mean, you have to recognize that. The question is, how do we deal with the inconsistencies that creates in terms of the speed, the level of ambition, and the challenges? That takes us into areas around carbon border adjustment mechanism as possible ways forward, which obviously is being looked at very seriously in Europe at the moment as part of the Fit for 55 and the implementation taking that forward. That raises its own challenges in terms of acceptability, interaction with the WTO, but it's about building this up. Again, it would be great to have a full top-down international system where we all do the same thing, but that's not, unfortunately, how the international community works. And we could spend another 20 years negotiating that, but I think we need to move forward with action without that framework and work out where we need to fill in, where we collaborate on the action, and where we may need to deal with some of the border issues that do arise.
Mm-hmm. Shuchi, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure, I agree with Paul. I think that's such a difficult, nuanced issue, and I think we see the debate even within our countries just on this particular topic. I think we've seen it in the United States, especially, you know, with the major kind of legislative packages that are moving around right now, that we don't even have internal agreement on this, and so the idea of having agreement on it in the near future just doesn't seem plausible to me.
Before I go to Stig, then talking about some of the the carbon, the cost incentives in the U.S. 45Q, Shuchi. There's a lot of proposals actually working its way through Congress now on enhancements to 45Q. Do you see any of those getting traction?
Yes, no, we are extremely excited to enhance 45Q. I think what those final numbers will be is very dependent on a lot of the debates going on, but I do think, you know, increasing the amounts for storage, increasing the amounts for direct air capture, increasing the amounts for industry are all going to be really important to enabling success. I think, you know, the numbers, whether or not they're priced right for individual sectors, remains a question, and I think we'll discover whether or not they are priced right when we see final numbers. But I think regardless, I think the fact that we have largely bipartisan understanding that these need to be improved is such a huge step forward in our political landscape. And so the fact that these conversations are happening and that, you know, I'm hopeful that an enhancement will pass is something that I'm really looking forward to supporting.
Yeah, thanks for that. Stig, back to international carbon tax. Do you have a view on that?
No, I agree that it's very unlikely. I don't see any possibility of that happening. But speaking about tax, I didn't say that earlier, but the Norwegian government has decided that it said publicly that in 2030, the tax level for CO2 emissions would be at a certain level. So they said recently that it will be around 180 euros. And they will then, in the annual budgets, fix it. So if you are part of the European trading system or something else, they will then do like a delta to make sure they get to there. And the purpose of this is, of course, to provide clarity and also for industry to have time to adjust to these very high levels of taxation. It's not popular at all, not even in Norway, but they are sticking by this.
Right, and then the last one that before we wrap up today, Sorry, I'm just looking at one more. If we look beyond OECD countries, those that are represented here, are there mechanisms that can be used most effectively in non-OECD countries? So, you know, if we look beyond Europe and North America, Shuchi, you talked about looking to leverage the experience and capabilities of the US. What are some of those mechanisms that can help non-OECD countries to deploy carbon capture and establish and implement more aggressive climate goals? Shuchi, can you start us there?
Sure. It's a difficult question. I think leveraging the work that the United States has done and continues to do is a really big part of that. And so the investments that we're making in demonstration, which are, you know, on par with hundreds of millions, if not billions, to demonstrate these technologies and to better understand prices and, you know, the second and third generations of these technologies that will be needed, is something that we can do that I think will help other countries the most, is to make those initial investments that are too high for other countries to make. You know, I'm hoping that we can also build more partnerships with these countries. And that's a much longer term, you know, idea that we hope to be able to leverage. But that's something that I think all OECD countries need to actually participate in. I think, you know, enabling the global south to make decisions and investments on their own without having any sort of dictated outcomes from the United States or other countries is a really important part of this. And so figuring out what that nuanced policy structure is and what frameworks we need to build, I think is a long-term conversation that we're excited to have.
Thank you. Paul, what's your view on mechanisms to support non-OECD countries?
Well, again, I think we're agreeing too much. It is a lot about, you know, demonstration. It's about getting the policy frameworks we can influence directly in place to move forward. For example, if we need to totally decarbonize industry, including those sectors like cement, where it's not simply shifting from one energy to another, it is dealing directly with the process emissions there too. You know, we need to find solutions, we need to deliver, we need to show things can work. But there is also scope for collaboration specifically around challenges. And I think that's the space which has been growing in the last few years. What spaces are there? Sharing experience, working directly around particular initiatives, particular projects. They can help a great deal to speed up the transition which is needed. But of course, there will also be, as I was saying a few minutes ago, those moments when we reach conflict is maybe too strong a word, but an incoherence between the speed we're going at and whatever. That's where the debates on tools such as carbon border adjustment mechanisms may start to become higher on the agenda, because it's countries are in competition in a global market. Including for many of the fundamental goods which are being produced. That's when, you know, having invested, yes, it's demonstration, but it's also taking those costs earlier. How do you deal with it when your competitors are not making the same level of effort or not on the same scale? It raises complicated questions, and we'll have to address those in the years to come.
Yeah, great. So let's leave it there. First, I want to thank all of the panelists for sharing their insights and experience with everyone today. I'd also like to thank the audience for being here and sticking with us through the full hour. Our Countdown to COP series, and Danielle, if you could put up the last slide, please. Countdown to COP series will be an ongoing series that will have another session every month until November. So please go to our website to see more details. If you want to learn more about carbon capture, you can read our global status report. This is the 2020 edition. Our 2021 edition will be coming out mid-October. So be ready for that to come out. And it's a great resource, everything you need to know about the current state of carbon capture. If you're on social media, feel free to follow or interact with us at Global CCS. And if you have any additional questions, you can contact us directly at info@globalccsinstitute.com. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks once again to the panelists very much. Hope you all have a great day.